Today's episode of BFD is handpicked, cage-free, and 100% natural. What does that really mean? You're about to find out. You want to put the best food in your body because your body is a temple. Or if you don't care for hokey analogies, your body is your body and you have to live in it, like all the time. So when it comes to food, we all know that organic tends to be better than non-organic. But before you sprint across the supermarket to put it in your cart, what does it actually mean? Well, here to help me demystify a few of these food buzzwords is TakePart.com's food editor, Willy Blackmore. Thank you so much for joining us, Willy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's going to be like a food buzzwords lightning round. So
Gotcha.
I'm going to give you a word or a label, and then you'll tell me what that actually means.
All right.
All right? Okay, so first and foremost, organic.
That starts with one that's not all that simple, but organic is a set of regulations that's decided upon by the USDA. It's something that farmers that want to get approved as organic and put organic label on their food, you have to fulfill a certain set of requirements, and they're really lengthy and complicated, and the whole process is kind of expensive.
Okay.
And just kind of arduous. So you have to prove, I believe it's 3 years that the ground you farm hasn't had any chemical pesticides used on it.
So is this a good set of regulations?
I think it's a very pragmatic set of regulations. There are definitely problems with it. I guess the one thing to consider if you're really, if that wants to be your guide, organic, is that you can have industrial scale organic or you can have like teeny tiny scale organic. Like I guess could get my backyard certified organic if I wanted to and like be able to put a USDA sticker on the tomatoes I grow. But that's going to look very, very different than something out in the Central Valley that's thousands and thousands of acres, and because it fits these standards, they can scale.
Right.
So if you're kind of concerned about, corporate farming, it can still totally be organic. So for smaller farmers, sometimes they choose to practice, like practicing organic is what the term they sometimes use, but they don't have the certification. And for some people, it's all about the label. And I overhear these conversations sometimes at the farmer's market. They'll be like, well, is this broccoli organic? And they're like, well, we don't use pesticides, we don't use fertilizer, so on and so forth. But is it organic? Like organic is one thing. That it means
Right.
one thing, it's defined by one thing. And it's really, really much more complicated than that. And that's why I use the word pragmatism or pragmatic a lot in referring to it.
Okay, up next, grass-fed.
The term 100% grass-fed is something that's regulated by the government, but it only means that the feed is grass. It doesn't say if the cattle get it on pasture, if they get it from hay, if they get it in a barn, if they get it in a field. It doesn't account for antibiotic use.
How about no hormones added / no antibiotics?
Okay, so no hormones added. You aren't allowed to use hormones in raising poultry or hogs at all. So if you're buying something that has that label on it and it's costing more money, the one that doesn't have that label on it doesn't have hormones in it either. In terms of antibiotics, if it says no antibiotics administered, that's something that's regulated. If it says antibiotic free, that's kind of meaningless because the USDA says that it's unprovable that it's actually antibiotic free, so it's a little bit wishy-washy.
So people who are trying to make it more expensive by saying it's special because it's no hormones are
It's
full
like
of crap.
you go outside and it says you're breathing air.
Right.
And you put a label on it and all of a sudden I'm breathing air. It's you're breathing air anyway,
Sure.
so why do you bother paying for it?
Okay, cage-free / free range.
Free range is something that's regulated. It means something, but what it means is that chickens can be outside for 5 minutes a day. I don't think there's anything really else to add to that. 5 minutes is that's free range. Cage free, it doesn't mean anything legally.
It doesn't mean anything legally.
Yeah. So it, in theory, means that they don't live in cages, but you can not live in a cage and live in one of those barns and be packed into space.
Right, and still ultimately be in a cage. Are there meats that you can research to see if they are a little bit more free range than the 5-minute free range?
A term that is like more in that direction is pastured or pasture raised.
Okay.
But it's a word that was kind of used by farmers and ranchers that were looking to market meats that were raised truly in that pastoral manner. But the definition is different from when you go from farmer to farmer, rancher to rancher. They say, well, this is pasture raised to me. Taking language and like simple 2-word phrases, 3-word phrases, and having them like contain the entirety of a food system is kind of inherently flawed. So if like you don't want to look at this stuff in depth and detailed right now, that's the best thing to go towards. Pasture raised, probably pretty good. But as more people do that, then people that have more vested interest in this, that have larger businesses, that have like more money in this game are going to try to get that and try to get you to buy their product by putting the label on there. And since it's not regulated, it's not defined, it's kind of this fluid thing, they can totally do that. I think it's one of two things. It's either a group of people can come together and say, we are this association and this is how we're going to define this thing, and it's going to be this really strict set of standards, and then we will say, our lexicon standards group, whatever, approves this and says this is what it is and this is what it means.
Right.
Or it can kind of slip into the mainstream and be further commodified and lose its meaning, and then it'll become like free range.
Right. Up next, we have vine ripened.
I don't even know what that means. Like it's so kind of, I think, detached from reality in a lot of ways. It's usually applied to those little tomatoes that you see like on the vine, and they're vine ripened. It doesn't mean anything. It makes you feel better.
We have wild caught.
Wild caught applies to seafood, and trying to figure out what anything means in the world of seafood is just inherently complicated.
Right, because that industry is all over the place too, right?
Yeah, and there's so many problems. So fishing for one species one way in one place, awesome, great, sustainable, good ecologically, environmentally. Do the same thing with another species in another place, and it sucks.
Sure.
So wild caught sometimes is wonderful for certain species, but then if you have like wild caught Patagonia toothfish or wild caught bluefin tuna, if you're eating bluefin tuna, you're eating what is essentially an endangered species. So if it's wild caught, it's really terrible that you're eating it. Aquaculture, which is the opposite side of like farm-raised seafood, has its own problems. But there are certain things like shellfish, for example, that are great to have raised in aquaculture. So
so do your research.
Yeah.
Fair trade. This is a big one.
Fair trade is usually something you see associated with products that are grown in the Southern Hemisphere and are very popular and common in the States and elsewhere in the Northern Hemisphere, like coffee, like chocolate, cacao beans, and tea. And really it's kind of different in the larger context of this discussion. It's less about how things are produced and it's more about labor. So these are often, third world countries, developing world, where these things are grown, and then they're really big export markets. Like coffee is a huge global export market. People that work in coffee plantations, it's backbreaking work, it's really tough work, and it's essentially something that says that these people are paid a fair wage when you're working in the fields, that they're getting their fair share.
So gold star for fair trade.
Yeah. Take care of the people that grow these things
make
and
your
harvest
food.
them
Yeah.
for you.
Okay, up next, natural.
This is one of these things that are like, yeah, it's natural. It's natural. It's totally natural. And it's like, it makes you feel like, of course, this is fine and good, but it just doesn't really mean anything.
Humane.
Okay, so humane is thrown around a lot in the context of meat products. So there are quite a few different third-party groups that will do certification, and so it'll be like humanely raised, humanely slaughtered. This can apply to eggs too, so it's not always meat products.
Okay.
One of the better ones to look for is animal welfare approved, and they kind of have one of the more rigorous sets of standards and get a lot of respect in the field.
So there's nothing through the FDA that says humane is an actual thing?
Not at all.
Interesting. Okay, we have fresh.
Sometimes you see this, fresh oysters. If they're not fresh, you really, really, really should not eat them because they'll like kill you. That's on you.
Yeah.
Like think about the definition of that word as you know it, and then think about the food you're eating. And if it's like a fresh steak,
Right.
Well, dry-aged steak is old steak and tastes great, but like chicken should be fresh. If it's not, it's gonna make you sick.
Non-alcoholic.
Like kombucha is one thing you can think about, that like you don't have to be 21 to buy kombucha, but there's like a very small amount of alcohol that gets created
Naturally
in that fermentation process. So I guess you can have things that are not labeled alcoholic that have some alcohol in them, and you would think of them as non-alcoholic.
Moving on, cold pressed.
Okay, so cold pressed is what you will hear if you go to the schmancy like juice place. Very, very popular. I think it's one of those words that people don't really think about what it exactly means. It's just thrown out there because like I drink cold pressed juices because that's what you do. It's good for you and it's like a detox thing. Essentially what cold press means is when you have juice or vegetables, they're like ground up and it's put into like a bag that is like kind of looks like pantyhose almost, like it's a really fine mesh thing, and then it's slowly put under pressure and it's pressed out, and so the liquid is removed and the solids are left behind. And the argument for cold pressed juices versus something that's like either ground with like a blade or some sort of centrifuge where it spins faster and like flings off the liquids from the solids is that there's not heat. And so if your whole thing is that the heat kills like the good things for you in that, then that's why you want cold pressed.
Hand-picked.
Okay, this drives me nuts. There's a billboard that was up on, I think it was on Melrose like 2 years ago, and it was a Ben & Jerry's advertisement, and it was for Cherry Garcia ice cream.
Right.
And there was a gigantic bowl of ice cream over the building, and it said hand-picked cherries. And that was the advertisement. And I guess that's supposed to make you feel like some like little cherry farmer in Vermont that like listened to the Grateful Dead, picked these cherries.
No, it's cute.
So here's the interesting thing. All sweet cherries in the United States, almost all of them are picked by hand. There's not technology that's been like tested and proven and been able to like be produced at mass scale to pick cherries by a machine. It's delicious and that's fine, but it just like, it's this total, it kind of like underlines all this stuff for me of you're being sold this like pastoral idea that just doesn't really exist.
Right. Okay, so the question on everyone's mind is, how are these GMOs and of course all of these other organic food going to be labeled? What is the future of labeling?
So GMOs are really kind of the current battle over labeling laws. It seems that the tide is going to kind of have to change on this. We probably will get GMO labeling. I don't know if it'll start like on a state-by-state basis or if federal law will happen. I know there are bills pending, but that's definitely the big question for the next year to 5 years probably.
Right. Willy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's been very enlightening.
I'm glad to help.
If you want to put the best things in your body, you have to know what these words actually mean. And you also have to avoid running like a lemming to the current it word on your food of choice. If you care about your food intake, read up and find the foods you like with the ethical, environmental, or social practices that you demand. And then of course, bon appetit. It's not easy, but it's worth it. Click the link in the description below to take action and help prohibit the use of antibiotics in healthy animals. For BFD, I'm Marisha Ray. Don't forget to subscribe. It's gluten-free.